Welcome back to Reform Thinking. We are taking on a really crucial moment in history today for this deep dive.
We are. It's a time when you could say the lines between heaven and earth got very, very blurry,
Yeah.
and it led to, well, centuries of conflict.
Exactly. Our whole deep dive today is about authority, specifically the historical and theological debates around the church's claim to worldly power.
And our source material for this is really top tier. We're drawing from one of the most significant works ever written on a subject, John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion.
Right, and Calvin spends a lot of time analyzing and really dismantling the claims made by the Roman pontiff.
He does. These were claims that, they didn't just stay in the spiritual realm. They extended spiritual care into this sweeping temporal rulership over nations and kings.
Which is why this is so critical, even for us today. Our mission isn't just a history lesson. It's about understanding the original vision for the church's role versus the political machine it became.
We're basically distilling Calvin's arguments against what he calls the inordinate and fraudulent claims of the papacy.
And we're going to see how he uses scripture, but also, and this is what I find fascinating, how he uses internal medieval witnesses to build his case.
Yeah, that's a key part of his method. So we've structured this to follow Calvin's critique. We'll start with the big theoretical claims to world supremacy, this idea of the two swords.
Okay.
Then we're going to get into the historical weakness of their main legal argument, which is the so-called donation of Constantine.
The famous forgery.
The very famous forgery. And finally, we'll look at the practical results of all this, the demand for clerical immunity from civil law, and what the early church fathers actually taught about being subject to the government.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going right to the heart of it. The assertion that the papacy held not just spiritual authority, but temporal rule over kings and empires.
The claim to both swords.
So Calvin starts by painting a really stark picture of papal ambition. This wasn't something that just, happened overnight. He describes it as an aggressive, escalating grab for land and for rule. He notes that the Roman pontiff was not satisfied with modest baronies, which were his initial holdings, but then he took hold of kingdoms, and then the biggest claim of all.
The empire itself.
The empire itself.
It's the sheer scale of it that Calvin wants you to see right away. I mean, a modest barony, that's one thing. Maybe a local prince gives some land to the church for its upkeep.
Sure, you can see how that might happen.
But to go from that to actively seizing control of established kingdoms and then claiming you're the boss of the Holy Roman Emperor, that completely changes what the papacy is.
It's no longer just a spiritual office.
Not at all. It becomes a geopolitical military power.
And when you start seizing land and thrones on that scale, you need justifications. You need a cover story.
You do. The source identifies 3 pretexts they used to hold on to these possessions, which Calvin very colorfully says were obtained by mere robbery.
So what were these pretexts?
Well, a word pretext is already telling, isn't it? He's saying they were just excuses. The first one was a claim of divine right.
Meaning God gave it to them directly.
Exactly. The idea that the Bishop of Rome inherited this temporal supremacy as part of Peter's legacy. The second, and probably the most famous, was that historical pretense we mentioned, the donation of Constantine.
The supposed legal document.
Right. And the third was just a catch-all, another title, which basically meant any other opportunistic legal or political trick they could use over the centuries to rationalize what they'd taken.
So you've got a theological claim, a historical/legal claim, and then a sort of general political one.
That's a good way to put it.
But before Calvin even starts tearing apart the historical lie, which we will get to, he brings in a rebuttal from a really surprising source.
And this is just a brilliant move in his argument. He brings in Bernard of Clairvaux,
who is not a Protestant reformer.
Not even close. Bernard was a 12th century Cistercian abbot. He was deeply pious, hugely respected, and absolutely devoted to the Roman Church.
So his critique can't just be dismissed.
No, it can't be brushed off as some kind of anti-church heresy. It's an internal correction.
Yeah.
He's actually writing to Pope Eugenius III, who was one of his own spiritual sons, you could say. He's writing as a loyal advisor.
And what does Bernard say? He argues pretty bluntly that this temporal lordship claimed by the papacy is not held by apostolic right.
It's a complete invention. And his reasoning is just devastatingly simple. He says, for Peter could not give what he did not have.
Right.
Peter was given the keys of the kingdom. He was given a pastoral, spiritual job. Peter didn't have armies or castles or crowns, so he couldn't pass them on to his successors.
So what did he pass on?
According to Bernard, he passed on the care of the churches, a responsibility for spiritual guidance, not for civil government.
To make that separation really clear, Bernard points the Pope to the example of Christ himself. He brings up that passage in Luke 12 where Jesus refuses to get involved in a dispute over an inheritance.
Yes, Christ says, "Man who made me a judge or a divider over you."
And that really puts up a theological wall, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, if the Lord and Master, who has all authority in heaven and on earth, explicitly says no to the very mundane task of settling a civil inheritance dispute,
Then how can his servant claim the right to rule over all men, all kingdoms, and all empires?
it's impossible. It shows that Christ himself kept a clear line between his spiritual work and the temporal government that belonged to Caesar.
And this leads to maybe the most pointed critique of all. Bernard tells the Pope directly, "Your power is therefore in misdeeds, not in possessions."
Let's just pause on that phrase, "in misdeeds." That is the core of the theological point.
Okay.
The keys were given to deal with sin, with misdeeds, the power to bind and loose, to pronounce forgiveness in the spiritual realm. They were not given to control possessions, land, wealth, property.
Bernard even asks, which is the greater honor, to forgive sins or to divide estates?
And the answer is obvious. Forgiving sins is the higher calling, the truly divine task given to the apostles. Dividing up estates is a worldly, earthly thing.
A base thing, as he calls it.
Right. And that's why Bernard draws a clear line between the jurisdictions. He says these base and earthly things belong to the civil world, which has its own proper judges, the kings and princes of the earth.
Then he turns that question back on the Pope.
He does. He asks, why do you invade another's border? He portrays the papacy's claim to temporal rule as a hostile takeover of the legitimate sphere of the civil government.
It really sounds like Bernard is just trying to get the Pope to remember his job description. What kind of imagery does he use?
He offers this really powerful counsel to Pope Eugenius. He says he was made superior not to domineer, but to minister.
To serve, not to rule.
Exactly. And here's the visual he uses, which is just brilliant. He tells the Pope, learn that you need a hoe, not a scepter, to do the prophet's work.
A hoe, not a scepter.
Think about that. A scepter is the tool of a king. It's a symbol of absolute temporal power. A hoe is the tool of a laborer. It symbolizes hard work, cultivation, humility, the actual work of a spiritual prophet, planting and weeding and building up the church.
So that's the forbidden contrast he lays out. You have to choose.
It's a mutually exclusive choice. Dare to take up lordship, and you cease to be an apostle. Or be an apostle and give up lordship. The mandate is clear. Lordship is forbidden. Ministry is bidden.
And Calvin's whole point is that this isn't some new Protestant attack. This is a great Orthodox teacher saying this centuries before the Reformation.
Precisely.
So if this was being said so clearly by such a respected voice in the 12th century, how did the papacy respond?
Well, the source notes that despite Bernard's powerful critique, the Roman pontiff went ahead and formally decreed in the Council of Arles that the supreme right to both spiritual and temporal belonged to him by divine right.
So they just ignored him and made it official doctrine.
They did. That decree is the institutional rejection of Bernard's spiritual advice. It takes the practical seizure of land and power and stamps it with a theological seal of approval.
And that really sets the stage for centuries of conflict with kings and emperors.
It absolutely does.
Okay, that feels like a perfect transition. We've seen the theological argument dismantled by an insider. Now let's look at the historical, legal leg they tried to stand on. The donation of Constantine.
Right, the infamous donation.
This document was supposed to be the crown jewel of their legal justification for ruling the West.
It was. It was a document supposedly written way back in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine. The story goes that when he converted to Christianity, he just granted control of the entire Western Roman Empire to Pope Sylvester I.
And Calvin's take on this is not subtle. He calls it fabulous and absurd.
He wastes no time. The sources make it clear that even in Calvin's day, this wasn't some sophisticated historian puzzle. He says anyone moderately versed in the history of those times could see that it was a fake.
Just on its face, the idea that a powerful emperor would just give away half of his empire while he's still running it.
It makes no historical sense.
And this is where we see Renaissance scholarship really helping the Reformation. Calvin points out that the best refutation of this document had already been done not by a theologian, but by a humanist scholar.
Lorenzo Valla. He says Valla had already roundly refuted that fable.
And Valla's work in the mid-1400s was a huge deal. He wasn't arguing theology, he was arguing about the Latin.
Yes, he was a master of philology, the historical study of language. He looked at the actual words in the document.
So what did he find? How did he prove it was a forgery?
He showed that the language was totally anachronistic. The Latin used in the donation was the kind of Latin you'd find in the 8th or 9th century, not the classical Latin of the 4th century, when Constantine was alive.
Can you give an example of what that means?
Sure. Valla pointed out certain phrases, vocabulary, even grammatical structures that simply didn't exist in Constantine's time. It would be like finding a document supposedly written by George Washington that uses the phrase surf the web.
Right. The language itself gives away the fraud immediately.
Exactly. So the very foundation of the papacy's legal claim to rule Italy and the West was known academically to be built on an 8th century forgery that was pretending to be a 4th century imperial decree.
That completely pulls the rug out from under their whole temporal argument.
It does. And Calvin then contrasts this proven fraud with the undeniable historical reality of one of the most respected figures in church history, Gregory the Great.
And Gregory serves as a witness against these claims, not by writing a critique, but just by living his life.
Right. His own letters and actions provide all the evidence you need. His language when writing to the Emperor Maurice is incredibly revealing.
What did he call him?
Gregory consistently addressed the emperor as his most serene lord, and in return he called himself Maurice's unworthy servant.
That's not just flowery language.
No, it's not just being polite. It shows a clear, accepted political structure where the Bishop of Rome was a subject of the Roman emperor in all temporal matters.
So the civil government had lawful temporal authority over the clergy, even the Bishop of Rome. Gregory didn't see himself as operating outside or above the emperor's rule.
Not at all. The source points out that Gregory was pleading for the emperor to be gentle in his rule, but he wasn't claiming to be exempt from that rule.
Okay.
He explicitly said the emperor shouldn't be too ready to take offense at priests, but that he should still rule them while giving them due reverence. It's a request for respectful government, not a declaration of independence.
He saw himself in common subjection like any other citizen when it came to earthly power. What about things like church property?
His words confirm his total acceptance of the secular ruler's authority there, too. There's a really telling quote where Gregory says he trusts God will give long life to our pious lords and will arrange the clergy under your hand according to his mercy.
Under your hand?
That's the language of subjection. It's an admission of obedience to the secular ruler's command in civil affairs.
Which is just a world away from the claims of the later popes who were saying they could depose emperors and demand their loyalty.
It flips the entire hierarchy on its head. Gregory, who was basically running the city of Rome during a time of chaos, still accepted that the ultimate legal and coercive power was with the emperor. He saw his job as managing spiritual things under the legal framework of the state.
So if the historical record was so clear, the donation was a lie, the early popes were politically subject to the emperor, how did the papacy keep defending this claim for so long?
Well, the source material focuses on what Calvin calls the shameless defense of a lost cause. It names a guy, Augustin Astutus, who basically worked as a hired pen for the papacy to try and revive the refuted claim of the donation.
So when history and logic fail, you hire a spin doctor.
That's precisely the accusation. Stucus is accused of scattering nauseating ditties, which means, worthless, long-winded, irrelevant arguments, to try and obscure the clear light of historical fact that Valla had already brought out.
The idea was to just overwhelm people with words, not persuade them with evidence?
Exactly. The source even says he pleaded his master's case feebly and was arguing a cause that was worthy of such a deceptive defender.
It sounds like Calvin is saying that by the 16th century, defending this temporal rule wasn't about theological conviction anymore. It was just paid-for propaganda.
That's the point. It was about protecting the political and financial assets they had acquired, not about defending the truth.
Okay, so we've established that the temporal claims were based on bad theology and a fraudulent document. So that brings up the big practical question. When did this massive temporal empire actually start to take shape?
Calvin gives a specific historical time frame. He says that less than 500 years before he was writing, the popes were still completely subordinate to princes, and crucially, no pontiff was created without the emperor's authority.
So the emperor still had to sign off on the election of a new pope? That's a clear sign of who's in charge.
A very clear sign of civil subordination. So this temporal empire was a relatively recent development.
That's a huge shift in a pretty short period of time. What was the historical event that opened the door for this change?
The instigator is identified as Emperor Henry IV, who's described as unstable and rash. Henry created the perfect opportunity by basically abusing church offices. He was selling or plundering German bishoprics.
The practice of simony.
Exactly. And this gave the reformers within the church a morally righteous cause to push back against imperial authority.
This sounds like the start of the big fight over investiture, who gets to appoint bishops, the pope, or the emperor.
That's exactly what it is. And this chaos was seized on by a man named Hildebrand, who became Pope Gregory VII. He was provoked by Henry's corruption, and he saw a plausible excuse to assert the church's power. And because Henry was already disliked by a lot of German princes, Gregory found a lot of support when he stood up to the emperor.
But the source seems to suggest that this plausible excuse wasn't his real motivation.
Right. It quickly pivots. Gregory VII is described as unclean and wicked, and Calvin argues that he eventually betrayed his malicious intention.
What was that?
His initial cause seemed pious, freeing the church from imperial corruption. But he quickly showed that his real goal was to replace imperial political control with papal political control.
So it wasn't about freedom, it was about a change in management.
And when that true intention was revealed, many of the princes who had initially supported him deserted him.
But the damage was done. His successors were able to build on that breakthrough.
They were able not just to shake off the imperial yoke, but to completely subject emperors to themselves.
And the source says this was helped along by weak leadership from the emperors who followed.
Yes, we can't forget the role of weak civil government in all this. The subjugation was aided by later emperors who were careless and cowardly in pushing back against the Pope's growing ambition.
So the rise of the papacy's temporal power wasn't inevitable. It was enabled by a failure of the secular government to do its job.
It was enabled by political neglect. When the magistrate fails to use his lawful authority to maintain order, the balance is lost.
Which brings us to the pretty grim cost of this dominion, especially in the couple of centuries leading up to the Reformation. We're talking about constant geopolitical conflict.
Yeah, the sources list the methods used. Popes ceaselessly invaded others' domains using fraud, treachery, and weapons of war.
That's the description of a warlord, not a spiritual minister.
It is. And this constant warfare and political scheming meant that for about 200 years, these efforts so troubled Christendom that they have nearly destroyed it.
And the destruction was tangible. The source notes that the city of Rome itself was only brought under the Pope's total control about 130 years before Calvin was writing.
Right. That was the final step in turning the papacy into a true territorial state.
To really drive home how far things had fallen, the source draws a sharp contrast with the standard of the early church, going back to Gregory the Great again.
The standard for purity was incredibly high back then. Under Gregory, the bishops got together and would anathematize any cleric who tried to occupy a piece of property just by, writing his own name on the title.
So just claiming a piece of ground, a relatively minor property crime, earned you the church's highest punishment, anathema.
Yes. And this sets up a devastating rhetorical question.
What's that?
If simply claiming a piece of ground deserved anathema, what punishments are strong enough for popes who practiced battles, bloodshed, slaughter of armies, sacking of some cities, destruction of others, massacres of nations, and devastations of kingdoms, all just to seize other people's land?
The implication is that the later papacy was committing atrocities for temporal gain that made the petty sins of the early church look like nothing.
The source says it plainly. Their motivation wasn't Christ's glory. It was worldly rule.
They were carried away by one lust for dominion.
And there's a critical scriptural reference here from Ezekiel 34. The source says they believed nothing was safe unless they rule with harshness and with might.
And that verse is describing the false shepherds of Israel who scattered the flock by ruling harshly.
By using that specific verse, Calvin is accusing the papacy of being theological tyrants. They adopted the methods of a destructive, worldly ruler instead of a nurturing spiritual shepherd.
That makes the shift from spiritual guide to secular tyrant crystal clear. So, let's move to how this played out on the ground. The controversial claim of clerical immunity. This claim is where the temporal ambition really affected everyday life and civil law. The Roman clergy basically said they were exempt from the regular court system.
Yes, they couldn't be called into a common court to answer for personal cases, things like debt or assault or property disputes.
And they saw this as a measure of the church's freedom.
They did. They held it beneath their dignity to have to answer to a civil judge. They believed that this exemption from the common laws was the very definition of the church's liberty and dignity. If they were subject to the same laws as everyone else, then the church wasn't truly free.
But once again, Calvin brings in the historical precedent of the ancient emperors and bishops to show that this claim was a new invention.
He does. What did a pious emperor like Constantine believe about his authority over the clergy?
He was pretty clear about it.
Very clear. He saw himself as having legitimate authority to maintain order. He decreed that if any bishop caused a disturbance, his audacity shall be restrained by official authority of a minister of God, that is, by my authority.
That's a stunning statement. Constantine sees himself as the minister of God in the civil realm, responsible for keeping even bishops in line.
It directly contradicts the later papal doctrine that the emperor is always beneath the pontiff. And another emperor, Valentinian, he agreed.
He reinforced the same idea.
He did, saying that good bishops obey our laws. The early church just accepted that for all matters of civil life, property, crime, contracts, the clergy were citizens, and they were subject to the civil government.
Now, we should be careful here. There was one acceptable exception, a boundary that even the early church recognized.
Yes, and the source is very clear on this. Ecclesiastical cases. So things like transgressing church canons or questions of faith or matters of internal church discipline, those were properly referred to the bishop's court.
So if a priest was accused of heresy, he wouldn't be tried by the civil court.
Right. The spiritual authority governs spiritual life.
Right.
The temporal authority governs civil life. It's a clean distinction.
And this sets up the perfect historical test case. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan.
Ambrose.
He was famous for standing up to emperors, but the source says he practiced singular moderation when it came to civil authority.
Ambrose really provides the blueprint for how these two spheres should interact. When the Empress Justina, who was an Arian heretic, tried to order him to the palace to debate a matter of faith, Ambrose fiercely resisted.
On what grounds?
He argued that in a case involving faith, bishops are supposed to judge emperors, not the other way around. He absolutely resisted the state trying to interfere in the spiritual office of defining doctrine.
And that's a laudable defense of spiritual jurisdiction. But what happened when the issue wasn't doctrine, but temporal things, like property or coercion?
That's where his singular moderation shines. He was totally unyielding on doctrine, but completely compliant on civil law. When the state offered violence, Ambrose said he would yield. He said, "I know not how to resist, for our weapons are prayers and tears."
Our weapons are prayers and tears.
He did not believe it was a bishop's job to defend the faith or the church's property with weapons or by inciting a rebellion.
And there's that famous quote of his on taxes and property, which just completely dismantles the later claims of clerical immunity.
It's totally unambiguous. He submitted fully to civil jurisdiction on temporal things. He said, "If the emperor seeks tribute, we do not deny it. The lands of the church pay tribute. If he seeks fields, he has the power to claim them. None of us resists."
So he pays taxes, and he submits to the government's right to claim land. That is a clear, full-throated acceptance of the civil government's supreme authority in the temporal world.
It is. And that's the crucial separation that Calvin is trying to get us to see. You can be a faithful spiritual leader while also being a fully obedient subject of the state in all civil matters.
So this helps define what these early church fathers actually wanted from godly rulers. It wasn't exemption.
No, it was stability and protection. They just wanted to prevent tyrannical violence from getting in the way of the church's spiritual work. They wanted the state to provide a safe and orderly environment for preaching and teaching.
They even approved of princes getting involved in church matters as long as it was for the right reason.
Right, as long as it was to preserve order and establish discipline. The state was seen as an ally in maintaining the outward peace the church needed to function.
And this is because the church has its limits. The source says the church does not have the power to coerce and ought not to seek it.
Meaning the church shouldn't have its own jails or soldiers or the power to impose civil penalties like fines or executions.
Since the church is limited to the spiritual sword, the word and church discipline, it becomes the duty of godly kings and princes to sustain religion by laws, edicts, and judgments.
Exactly. The civil government is given the coercive sword to enforce justice, and part of that justice is supporting the conditions needed for true, ordered religion to flourish.
And we see Gregory the Great confirming this again at the end, even when he was being corrected by the emperor.
Yes, when Emperor Maurice ordered bishops to receive fellow bishops who had been exiled by barbarians, Gregory obeyed and told everyone else to obey. And even when Maurice chastised Gregory about something else, Gregory promised to obey as far as his conscience will allow.
And he said the emperor was acting as becoming to a pious prince by giving such commands to bishops.
Gregory's obedience, even when he had some reservations, just reinforces the whole concept. The civil government has lawful authority over the outward actions of the clergy. The only boundary is conscience and the word of God, but the jurisdiction of the prince is not denied.
It's a very compelling case from the sources. The papacy's claim to temporal power was a new thing, achieved through political maneuvering and fraud, and maintained by warfare and tyranny. They usurped the proper function of the civil magistrate, a function the early church willingly submitted to.
Well, if we look at the whole picture that Calvin is painting here, I think the core takeaway is this radical separation of spheres. The historical record, backed up by people like Bernard and Gregory, it just rigidly divides the church's spiritual ministry, which is focused on sin and the care of souls, from the civil magistrate's temporal governance, which is focused on property and maintaining order through force.
So the Roman pontiff's claim to have and rule with both swords is just exposed as a complete contradiction.
It contradicts both spiritual principle and the actual practice of the early church.
And the practical conclusion from all this is pretty clear. The church should never seek the coercive power of the state. Its weapons are prayers and tears.
Right.
And yet the sources also give a specific active duty to the civil magistrate. This duty of godly kings and princes to sustain religion by laws, edicts, and judgments.
That dual mandate is the critical tension point. It's what defined Reformed thinking on the doctrine of the two kingdoms. It accepts the legitimate authority of the secular government, but at the same time, it constrains the church to purely spiritual means.
So here's the final thought for you to consider based on this framework we've been looking at. The source material argues the church has to rely entirely on spiritual authority.
Right.
If the civil authority's original duty was to sustain religion with laws and judgments, how should believers today interpret and apply that specific duty of the magistrate, the civil office, in modern societies where the state is, religiously neutral or highly pluralistic?
That's a huge question.
It is. Does that duty still apply? And if it does, how does the spirit of Ambrose's resistance to spiritual interference on the one hand versus his submission to civil coercion on the other help us understand the proper limits of government today?
It's a question of how a historical theological framework gets applied to our very different contemporary political realities. Definitely something worth mulling over until our next deep dive.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to sharing more insights with you next time.